Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So what I'd like to do is show you how to solve an absolute value inequality. And when looking at an absolute value inequality, we want to create two cases, just like we would create two cases for an equation. So before I get to my two cases, let's just kind of look at a basic inequality with some numbers. So I could say the absolute value of 3 is going to be less than 5. And the absolute value of 3 is going to be greater than 1. Now, since we're dealing with an absolute value inequality, or absolute value, we know that obviously I could also say the absolute value of -3 is less than 5, and the absolute value of -3 is greater than 1, correct? That's going to work for both of them. Now, when we're going to look into this, the next thing that we want to be doing is, well, that's kind of obvious looking at that with numbers, but what about if I looked at this with just a variable that we didn't know? Okay, and when looking at this, when we have a less than, that is going to create a compound inequality that's going to be in form of the and when you have a greater than, that's going to be create a compound inequality that's going to be form of or, and it'll make a little bit more sense as we get into problems that are going to, when we graph them. However, so kind of going back into this idea, let's pretend we know that it's going to be x and negative x. So I could say x is less than 5, as also as negative x is less than 5. But if I want to solve just for x, I need to divide by 1 on both sides. So really what I'm graphing is x is less than 5, and x, remember, divided by a negative number is greater than -5. So, I'm sorry, I forgot to write the and. So when we create a compound inequality with less than, what we basically want to do is set up our two cases, just as is. But when we create our negative case, we're going to reverse the sign and make our other side negative. For the or, we're going to do similar to the same thing. I'm going to say x is greater than 1, or negative x is greater than 1. Well, again, we want to solve for x, or graph x, so I divide by -1. So I say x is greater than 1, or x is less than -1. And those are going to be your two inequalities that you're going to graph. Now, the last thing I can say, when you're graphing your inequalities, this is like a very basic, two very basic compound inequalities. When you have something that has more operations, before you set up your two cases, notice on each of these two cases that my absolute values are isolated. So if I have like 3 times 2x minus 5 plus 1 is greater than 13, right? Before you set up your two cases, you have to isolate the absolute value. That means get rid of the 1 and the 3. So you have to go ahead and use your inverse operations. This would be 12 divided by 3, divided by 3. So I have 2x minus 5 is greater than -4, absolute value. Now I can set up my two cases, where my two cases would be 2x minus 5 is greater than -4. And since I started with the greater than, it's going to be an or. So I'd write or 2x minus 5, and then flip the sign and then negate the other side. Less than +4. And then those would be my two inequalities that I'd go ahead and graph, or go ahead and solve and then graph. And you would do the same thing if it was a less than. The only difference is now my graphs would be in the and format. So that would be less than, and that would be greater than. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That is kind of like your basic process for solving an absolute value inequality. Thanks.